My name is Brad Lusk. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Math, or STEAM Team affinity group with the AAAS. Our group works on three primary pillars of outreach. So one of them is kindergarten through 12th grade and post-secondary outreach. So we try to connect individuals that are interested in the sciences with STEAM professionals, that being AAAS fellows. The other one is diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEAM. And so we reach out to traditionally underrepresented communities in STEAM and try to promote a multi-directional exchange of ideas and values between STEAM professionals and the communities that we work in. And the last pillar is to encourage the integration of science and art. And so this happens through events that emphasize science communication, and also kind of working with artists and maybe scientists who are interested in the arts in our communities as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, who will introduce our speaker today.
Thanks, everybody. I'm Chris Sunderick, and it is my honor and privilege to introduce our guest tonight, Dr. Katie Wu. Dr. Wu is a staff writer for The Atlantic and a senior producer for The Story Collider. She's previously written for the New York Times, the TV show Nova Next, and was an early career fellow at the Open Notebook. She's also a AAAS Mass Media Fellow, who was placed with the Smithsonian Magazine and was a production editor at Under. Dr. Wu earned her PhD in immunology and microbiology from Harvard and is the 2020 winner of the Everett Clark Seth Payne Award for Young Science Journalists. Welcome, Dr. Katie Wu.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, Katie, I hope we can start with your career trajectory. A lot of us have transitioned out of academia into into work outside of research. Most of us being in science policy, but everybody in the STEAM group is collectively interested in the public engagement, outreach, and education. So maybe we could start off with you telling us a little bit about how you went from academia into science journalism and how you were able to leverage your scientific background into that role.
Yeah, so I actually would not be here without the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship that I did. I did that for 3 months while I was still in grad school. I just took a brief leave since it was only a 10-week fellowship, so pretty short and containable within grad school itself. Prior to that, I had really done pretty much no professional science writing, but I did that fellowship. I actually liked it way more than I thought I would. I thought it was just going to be a summer and then I would head back to the lab, but I liked it so much that I knew that my defense date was coming up in a couple months. I figured it was actually a perfect time to apply to some jobs and just see what would happen. At the time, I thought, it's pretty hard to break into this field. Maybe I won't be able to do it, but I'm just going to see what happens. And if I flame out, I flame out, or I'll just keep doing this until I can't get hired anymore. That was 3 years ago. So I'm actually not that far into this. It was a really tough decision, though. I loved grad school. I actually loved doing bench work and science and going to lab meetings and going to conferences. There are plenty of unsavory things about academia, but I really did like it. And I had seriously been considering doing a postdoc, trying to get a faculty job, doing the whole tenure track thing. But I think I got really lucky, and it came down to a decision for me of doing something I really loved and doing something I loved even more. I know not everyone has the privilege to be making that choice, but that's kind of how I ended up here. I don't think anywhere I have worked has hired me explicitly because I have a PhD. They've sort of seen it as a perk. So I don't know how much I ended up really leveraging my expertise as a scientist for the job that I do now, but I definitely use those skills every day. I certainly don't regret going to grad school, and I've felt very lucky to have those skills behind me, especially this past year, reporting on infectious disease, which is what I spent so much of my time thinking about. I think that definitely did directly benefit me while reporting this past year. Before that, I was writing about all manner of things, mostly nothing to do with my field, because I felt like honestly, no one cared about infectious disease, but it'll be interesting to see how the landscape shifts as we sort of transition out of pandemic life.
So let's talk about infectious diseases and current events. So recently, the CDC amended their guidelines for vaccinated people. The CDC have said now that vaccinated people no longer need to wear masks in both indoor and outdoor settings, unless, with some exceptions, namely public transit, hospital settings, prisons, et cetera, or where private businesses demand it. There's been celebration and concern from many Americans regarding the new guidelines. The CDC has said that the change in guidelines is based on new studies that show that fully vaccinated people have a very low risk of infection and low risk of transmission, so low risk to others. But these data are based on results taken only from those fully vaccinated with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, not the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. There's also concern that this was a political decision, that the administration or the CDC wants to reward or incentivize unvaccinated people, reward or incentivize unvaccinated people to get vaccinated so that they no longer have to wear masks in public anymore. And concern is also supported by children and immunocompromised people who cannot get the vaccine, at least not yet. So I wanted to ask your opinion on these new guidelines. Do you think they send the right message to the public, or do they send the wrong message?
Yeah, I mean, this decision was particularly controversial, and I think I don't have a really strong personal opinion, but I see a lot of different sides here that are probably worth talking through. First, I do think there is strong enough data to support the idea that vaccinated people really probably are not very frequently transmitting the virus to other people, or even carrying the virus that frequently. It's not perfect. There is no perfect vaccine in existence. So there is going to still be a small percentage of people who do end up, transmitting the virus to people, but it is vastly, vastly reduced by the shot. So I think the science is fairly sound, especially for the mRNA vaccines, as you pointed out. And I think there's good reason to believe that, if we're looking at the Johnson & Johnson numbers, it's still like so much better than not having any vaccine at all. And that protection really continues to build up over time. So the longer you're vaccinated with any vaccine, it's going to look better and better. And obviously we don't know where that ends, but right now in the short term, it's really looking very good. Scientifically, it's sound. From an immunological perspective, it's sound. From an epidemiology perspective, it's sound. I think what the guidance could have maybe been more conservative about is the science of human behavior, because no one is turning green when they get vaccinated. No one gets a tattoo stamped on their forehead. We can't look at the people around us and figure out who is vaccinated and who is not. This has kind of transformed the country into this giant chessboard where everyone has to operate on the honor system, and that gets really, really, really complicated. I guess I see the argument for this possibly incentivizing people to get their vaccines, but at this point in the pandemic and at this point in the vaccine rollout, a lot of the people who decided they weren't going to get vaccinated, something like this isn't going to sway them. A lot of people who might not otherwise have gotten vaccinated are maybe not going to be incentivized by a mask mandate, because there's overlap between people who didn't want to wear masks and people who didn't want to get vaccinated. It is tricky. I hope there is, a group of people who is pushed over by this new guidance, but it is tricky. I've seen a lot of people question the timing of this decision, which I think is really interesting. I don't think we necessarily needed to wait for that much more data, because the data that's been coming out has really been reinforcing itself repeatedly, and that's really wonderful to see. What is a little weird about the timing is, we're coming up on a long weekend where people were probably going to enjoy the good weather, gather, and that would have been a really interesting data point to wait for. The decision also came just days after the FDA authorized the Pfizer vaccine for kids as young as 12. Like those kids didn't even have a chance to get their second shots and become fully vaccinated. So we could have waited for that enormous sector of the population, millions of people, to sort of join the ranks of the fully vaccinated. It's just a very tricky time. I do hear you about the political motivations. I won't comment too much on that because, as you've all probably noticed, I'm not a policy person. But I do think it is really interesting. There has been a lot of pressure to incentivize people and make it really clear cut what the benefits of vaccination are. And the people up top are under a lot of pressure. I do think it would have been wise for them to, I think, broaden their definition of who has the expertise to comment on vaccination guidance. And that includes experts in human behavior, risk mitigation, and communication around vaccines. And my impression is that that did not happen to the fullest extent that it could. So I realized that was like kind of a big non-answer. I feel mixed about this whole thing. And at this point, we can't unring the bell that has been rung. So we just have to move forward with it and see what happens.
Well, I think that leads into my next question really well, which is how do the new guidelines affect the social fabric of the country? And what I mean by that is, before vaccines became widely available, everyone was more or less on the same footing. The rules applied equally to everyone, whether or not they actually follow the rules. But the moral landscape, the risk landscape was relatively flat. Now that over nearly 40% of the country is fully vaccinated, and with the new guidelines saying that fully vaccinated people don't have to wear masks in a lot of situations, and on top of that, no way of knowing just from looking at people who is fully vaccinated and who isn't. How do we get around interpreting others' intentions? Whether they come in good faith and have good intentions or not?
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's something that I've written a little bit about. It's incredibly tricky. There's never going to be a set of guidelines that can encompass every single possible risk calculation a person can be faced with in their day-to-day life. Like the CDC is one entity, and there are hundreds of millions of people trying to grapple with what that guidance is saying. And unfortunately, because now we're putting people on sort of different immunological footing, that sort of punts a lot of the decision making and the risk calculus to individual people who have to say, like, here are the 18 factors I'm considering about my day. Do I put on a mask? Do I gather? Do I invite this extra person to lunch with me? It's really hard. And there are a lot of people who are sort of getting polarized in their response. People are giving up and saying, you know what, I'm just going to go back to pre-pandemic life. It's probably fine. There are other people who are saying, I cannot handle this. I am going to sort of default to the most cautious behavior possible. And, if I choose the safest option under every circumstance, I hopefully can't go wrong. It's really tricky because I think with something like, the food we eat or the drugs we take, those are decisions that primarily impact us and only us. It's about our bodies. But with an infectious disease, the decisions we make drastically impact other people, and the decisions other people make drastically impact us. It's really, really tense. And I think that has fueled a very blame-heavy culture, and it's fueled a lot of ambiguity. So there's no clear answer to this. I think the best thing people can do at this point is just try and develop some guidelines that are fitting for them as like a single individual and say, hey, I am comfortable with taking this much risk. I know the science of like this vaccine probably protects me from catching the virus. It almost certainly is really, really protecting me from getting seriously sick. How much risk am I as an individual willing to take on? And how does that stack up against what I have in my day-to-day? What I've been trying to tell people is like, this ever expanding list of things that vaccinated people can do once they hit that 2-week mark post second dose. Those are options. They're not obligations. No one is going to take your mask off for you. If you want to keep your mask on, keep it on. If you want to eat outdoors with your friends, do it. Don't let someone else's decision stop you. And I'm also trying to, I think, encourage people to start getting comfortable talking to other people about vaccination, because you do want to ideally know the status of the people around you. If you can't, maybe it's safer to default to assuming that they're not vaccinated. But if you can get that information, ask about it. It might feel uncomfortable for some people because it is personal medical information. What sometimes works is volunteering your status and seeing if people reciprocate. And hopefully the sort of common courtesy of that interaction comes into play a little bit.
You recently wrote in The Atlantic about pandemic inertia and how you and others are going to need some time to kind of get used to the way things were, get used to the norms that we had in the before times. And this is something that I really sympathize with as well. The idea of going back to a bar or a restaurant, frankly, fills me with anxiety and a little bit of dread. Not only because it's something that's been absent from my life for so long, and not only because of the lingering risk of COVID transmission, however much reduced it is now, but also just how socially clumsy I must be now after being in isolation for so long. Is there anything that you're doing now to kind of prepare to reemerge into the world and return to normal?
Yeah, I mean, even before the pandemic, I was not what you would call a social butterfly. I spent a lot of my free time like at home watching TV, and I'm good doing that. I mean, I feel really lucky to have a home and, access to like Netflix and all those wonderful things that have like brought me comfort for a long time. I know it's been a lot tougher for my super extroverted friends, but, for me, the tough part is re-emerging into society and getting all these invitations that have stacked up for the past year, weddings, going out to restaurants and things. I'm really sincerely just trying to take it one day at a time. And I've like definitely declined some invitations to like big groups of people doing things. My husband is a little more social than I am, and he's like really easing back into things. I'm not doing exactly the same thing at the same pace, and that's totally fine. Like, he's not upset about it. I'm not upset about it. I just feel good that I know that I'm not the only one making decisions this way, and knowing that, yeah, it's like not a huge deal. The world will still be there for me a week from now if I decide to take a step then, or a month after that.
All right. Well, thanks, Katie. And far be it from me to continue sucking up all the oxygen in the room. Let's open it up to the audience. If you want to ask a question, just indicate so in the chat, and I'll call on you and invite you to come off mute. Or it's a relatively intimate group this evening, so you can just jump in.
I'll ask a question.
Sarah.
Hi, Katie. I'm interested in since you've had experience writing at several different outlets, I was wondering if you could share kind of your preference for science writing, whether you prefer writing longer features or kind of quicker turnaround, shorter stories, or if you like a mix of those ideally.
Yeah, I think I'm still kind of figuring out, what I want to do for the rest of my life in terms of style and everything, but I'm really very happy at The Atlantic. Granted, I've been here for 4 months, so take that with a grain of salt. But when I was at the Times, the big driver was news and getting stories out there quickly. Of course, like accurate, clear, compelling stories, but it was about breaking news. The Atlantic is, first and foremost a magazine, and the like slightly annoyingly pithy way I like to put it is I'm no longer really being asked to break the news, but more break down the news, which I really like to do. I love explaining things. I like taking my time with pieces. I don't think I could ever be the type of person who writes only like 4 10,000 word stories a year and just call it a year. I think I would go absolutely insane. I need small, discrete, publishable units to kind of make me feel like I'm being productive, and I know, I'm working on this thing this week and another thing another week. I also get bored very easily, which I think is part of what pulled me out of the lab. I love being able to just dive into a ton of different topics, especially ones that I'm totally unfamiliar with. Like I like being surprised by my own work and the conversations that I have. So yeah, but I think the freedom of having like a website where there's no inches of page that have to be filled exactly down to the single letter gives me a lot of room to sort of play with not just my reporting but my writing, and really I just want to tell interesting stories. That's a very like amorphous way to approach my job, but it's what I love doing the most.
Thanks.
So I had a quick question, Katie, and this kind of ties in with that, but is there any sort of, like, how do you go about picking what your next topic is going to be? For example, some of the things in the Atlantic now, you have the one on the evolution of the anus and then another on ants, and it's really cool and, pretty broad. Are there any specific guidelines that they have, or is it really a lot of your own choice and what, like you said, interests you?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a little bit of both. Like the process of this is, I'm on the science desk, which is not so much a desk, it's like a weird agglomeration of like 6 people. And so really anything within science is kind of fair game. They do still want us reporting on the pandemic because it is still so newsworthy and still such a dominant force in people's lives. So I'm trying to spend at least, 2/3 of my time on that. This is kind of a weird week that I've had 2 non-pandemic pieces in a row. So I'm always thinking about that. But even within the pandemic, I do try and specialize. I really like writing about, immunology and how the immune system works, how vaccines work, and just kind of the individual decisions people are making at this point in time. Outside of that, I mean, I'm definitely a biology writer, a life sciences writer. I'm not a chemist or physicist, and those types of pieces destroy me. So I don't do them. But even within biology, I love infectious disease. I think it's super interesting, and I love really bizarre things about the natural world. I think especially before the pandemic, my favorite stories to write were always the ones that I hoped would make my readers like look out their window or go on a walk down the street and look at something that, has been there literally every day and go, huh, wow, I had never thought of this natural thing that way before. So my stories involve bizarre animals, insane plants, just, I don't know. I had a friend who once called these things brights because they were sometimes the things that you could pull out at a party and just kind of brighten the conversation with a cool factoid or a bizarre thing about the world.
Thank you.
I guess I should append onto that. I don't get to write like anything I want. I always do have to run it past an editor and make sure like the angle is there. Why write about it now? Why write about this in particular, not something else? And like, why would I be particularly well equipped to write about it? And so the editors are super crucial in that respect. And I do like very occasionally get assignments, like the editors say, hey, we do need someone to write about this. That happened more frequently other times, but just thought I'd drop that in there. I do not have complete free reign, nor would I want to, because that sounds terrifying.
Maybe I can selfishly jump in with another question. I'd like to ask a little bit about your process, if any, for coming up with stories to write about, because it seems to me that every time that there's a newsworthy research paper that gets published, within the day, multiple outlets have written some kind of explainer on it, a summary on it, and then maybe over the course of the next following days, there are think pieces and pieces to break it down, as you said. So do you have a process for coming up with stories to write about? For example, how did you come up with the idea to write about the evolution of anuses?
It varies so much from story to story. So science journalists have access to a lot of journal articles before they are formally published through like an embargo system. And so, a fraction of stories do come out of that, including some COVID stories. But I think for the bigger pieces, it's just kind of like what I see people talking about, thinking about, wondering about, or if I see something and I can't stop thinking about it for like 2 days, why was that? If it captured my attention this much, someone else out there hopefully feels the same way. That's kind of how the AAAS story came about. Honestly, like I was writing about spiders sometime last year, and I was talking about like how they spin their webs. They make their own silk in their abdomens and just like squirt it out their rears. And I posted on Twitter like, do spiders technically have butts? Is that just a mammal thing? And like I got all these really interesting responses. And like months later, it was still kind of lingering on my mind. So I decided to look into butts and anuses, and I found out there were all these controversies and mysteries, and like we still don't understand this fundamental part of our biology. And I thought this could be a great story, and I talked to my editor about it. Not every story comes out that way. Like sometimes literally I will just be talking to an expert that I really like, and they'll say, hey, I've been thinking about this one thing, or this is something that people are starting to gather data about and it looks surprising. That can also be a great story. But I think to turn a topic into a story, it needs to have stakes. It needs to, tell the reader, like, you will be better off or more informed in some way if you read this piece. This matters to you specifically because, this involves a part of your body, or this, this could affect your health or a decision you make in the next 24 hours or something. That's kind of what every story needs to some extent.
Hi, Catherine. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, sorry.
I'm just waiting for you to ask your question. Hi.
My work computer is sometimes weird, so I wasn't sure. So one thing I was curious about, and I was interested to hear you mention you had like kind of specific focuses you were interested in during like the pandemic on those stories. And I guess, how do you try to distinguish yourself on like stories that everyone are going to cover because they're so newsworthy or because they're so important?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think especially because The Atlantic is usually not going to be the first outlet that gets to a story, we really want to make sure that we are adding context. And I think one priority that we've had during this pandemic especially is to be really forward-looking as best as we can without being like preachy or like, we definitely know what's going to happen to you next Tuesday at 4:35 p.m. Just like this idea of clarifying the moment. So if you are seeing this thing in the news all the time, why are people freaking out about it? Are they overblowing it? Are they not appreciating one aspect of it? Here's how we can explain that. It's almost taking like a meta view on like what people are talking about. Like we want to hit the moment and understand like, why are people fixating on this one thing? Can we go a little deeper into that and either calm people's fears or like really, I guess, guide their attention to the appropriate place? So I think that's something that distinguishes our coverage. And another thing that I really enjoy about being at The Atlantic is our pieces can be a little bit more voicey. Like, I like to think that some readers can read my pieces and tell that I wrote them, for instance, and not like Ed or Sarah or Rob. Just because like we're allowed to put a little bit more of ourselves in the piece and sort of talk to the readers, not tell them what to think or say like, I am here to intrude on your thoughts about this phenomenon, but just sort of put our mark on it in a way that is just really, it's really nice. And that alone can sometimes distinguish a piece.
Hey, I had a question, not a question, but a comment. So you wrote a story about wrinkle face bats like last year that I ended up reading, and I'd studied them in the past, and it like made me think about them in a new way. And because the story was about how they might possibly lek, and it's like one of the few mammals that may lek. And so I just wanted to tell you, like, I'm writing a paper about an observation about these same bats. And I really appreciated your story. And I could tell like you had written it because I was like, wait, it's the same person who writes the trilobites and like these really cool random things. And so, yeah, I just really appreciated that.
Oh, thank you. That's so nice.
I had a question. I recently read an article just today about how sort of emotionally draining and traumatic it has been for journalists covering the pandemic the past year. And I'm wondering if you can speak at all to getting sucked into your stories and when that can be a negative and how you handle that.
Yeah. I mean, I can of course only speak for myself, but it's really weird. I think being so early in my career has made this pandemic especially interesting to go through because like half of my career has been reporting on this pandemic, half of my journalistic career. I was talking to Carl Zimmer about this the other day because he lives like 5 miles away from me. And he was like, yeah, that must be really weird for you because he's been doing this for like decades and the pandemic has been a much smaller fraction of his career. He has a baseline to sort of return to, but I feel like I'm struggling to think of what 6 months from now is going to look like. What will I be covering? How hard will I be working? It's been really tough this year. I think especially when I was at the Times when things were especially tense and fraught and stories were coming out like every second. I was sometimes paralyzed with like how much work I had to do, and I spent a lot of late nights. There were times when I was assigned a story at 9 p.m. and I had to file it by 11 p.m. and it would go up at 11:30 p.m. It was crazy, but it also felt necessary. Like if we weren't there to report it, it's a possibility that no one else would. And so, I mean, I was grateful for the opportunity. I don't regret any of that, but it really did drain me. And there certainly were stories that sucked me in emotionally. I wrote several stories about people who, had gotten incredibly sick or had lost people that they loved or hadn't been appreciated or had been attacked by people because of the way that they were doing their science, which, I think for a lot of us would have been kind of unthinkable a couple of years ago that people would get this worked up about, data that people were just acquiring in the lab, like seemingly commonplace things. And I think when you're writing a story that goes that deep or asks people about incredibly personal experiences, they often get emotional. You often get emotional. It's kind of a double-edged sword because it helps you tell the best story you can, but it also, it physically pains you. It's just a part of the, being a human writing about other humans. So yeah, it's been a really tough year, but I feel really lucky to have a support network. I have a partner and I have friends who are journalists and have been going through the same thing. Really, I think in a lot of ways, I've been privileged to have a job that has been kind of this cushy and in many ways necessary during the pandemic. So I don't think I've necessarily, I certainly don't think I've suffered worse than other people. But I've definitely faced some unique challenges. It has been hard to sort of adjust. I will also just like complain briefly here. Working from home sucks, which I'm sure you've all experienced to some extent. You're also like all seeing my cats walk across the screen. Like working at home is super weird. And there are parts of me that can't wait to go back to the office after all of this is over.
Am I the only one who can't hear Erica? I saw that she unmuted herself, but I can't hear anything.
Yeah, I can't hear Erica.
My bad. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah,
Hi.
I forgot. external mic. Yeah, you kind of touched on this a bit in the fact that you're writing on something that's kind of emotionally draining and also elicits emotional responses from people. And I was just wondering if you have had any experience where people have reacted negatively or even had just, yeah, maybe even negatively to your story and how you go about responding to that, or do you just not respond, and whether you have advice for that?
Yeah, that is a really good question. Totally. I get hate mail every day, every day. Like, and so like a lot of it is pretty tame. Some of it is crazy. I've gotten death threats. I've gotten rape threats. Like people are very angry right now, especially. I mean, I think part and parcel of having such a public facing job, people are going to find reasons to get upset. But I think especially during a time of crisis, you know, I don't know what these people are going through, but some of them really want to find reasons to get angry and they want people to blame so that they feel that they have a semblance of control over their life. I like 99% of the time, I really try not to respond. Obviously, if someone's like, oh, I caught an error in your piece, or I feel like you misrepresented something, or I really wish you had included X, Y, and Z, like that can be really helpful for me. I feel like some of the feedback I get, like some of the best feedback I get comes from my readers. I am not all knowing, and I just really appreciate when people take the time to try and expand my perspective. And I found stories that way, but I think when it's clear that someone is going after you as a human being, or like they are just like, if somebody is saying your piece is crap because vaccines aren't real or the virus isn't real, like that's a totally, like you have to bin that in a totally separate category, and just try and let it slide off. I'm a very like fragile person, so like it hurts. And I'm definitely still working through how to really, I think, package all of that into something that I can just set aside at the end of the day and not think about. It's a work in progress. All journalists are humans, but I also reject the notion that all journalists have to be like super thick-skinned and like, I don't know, superheroes who never let this stuff get to them. I support the idea that people can and should be vulnerable and have the right to complain to other people. I think it is important to mention here that like there are a lot of people who I think come after me specifically or harder than they otherwise would because I'm a woman of color. And like I've talked to so many of my white male colleagues who are also science journalists who have been reporting on the pandemic. And they're like, yeah, I've never gotten a threat from a reader, or like their readers don't try and mansplain stuff to them. It is a very different landscape for certain people to work in this field, especially because the field of journalism is kind of still dominated by a lot of white people. The gender balance has been a little bit better in recent years, but it's tricky. A lot of people feel that I am not qualified to report on a topic because of who I am, and that's tough. But I really hope that that's changing based on like who else is reporting these stories and the types of experts that we're including in these stories.
Katie, can you talk a little bit about the mentors who have helped you along your career and guided you to where you are now, and what you felt were the best things that they did for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think what is really fortunate about the field of journalism is that pretty much every editor you have kind of becomes a default mentor in some way. And, you know, editors aren't just there to like catch typos. They structure your pieces. They are like sounding boards when you need to vent or just talk through a story or something that you're obsessed with. I'm really grateful that I've had pretty much just an endless parade of wonderful editors who are really supportive, and like these are also the people who will protect you when you get like death threats, rape threats. That is one huge perk of having a staff job and having a team of people and infrastructure to support you. Other mentors I've had, I think I really did pick up through that AAAS Mass Media Fellowship. And not all mentors are people who have a ton more experience than you. 3 of my best friends are 3 people I met through that fellowship who weren't even in the same state as me. That the fellowship scattered us all over the country. So I've spent far more time with them online than I have in person, but we still talk like every single day. We have a group chat, and 3 of us are full-time journalists now, which is just very cool to see that we all came out of this fellowship and decided to converge on this thing. The last person works in science communication at a university, so he's not too far afield of what we're doing. And I feel like, this is corny, but like they mentor me. That they're my peers, but we mentor each other. I've also kept a lot of my mentors from my formal scientific career. I'm still in touch with my PI from grad school, and he's just a really wonderful person. I would not have been able to do this job if he had not been so supportive during grad school and said, do what makes you happy. I don't care if you stay in academia or not. I think anywhere I go, I've stopped taking jobs or assignments just because of names or flashiness or topic. I think every job I take from this point on will be because I'm going there for the people. And that's super, super important, especially in my field. I think journalism is often viewed as this very solo pursuit, but I wouldn't be able to do anything that I do without my colleagues.
So I have another question just about science writing. And was it through originally doing the AAAS fellowship or just your natural writing style? But it seems a lot of times scientists in general are very good at writing to other scientists, but very bad at then breaking that down for the public, which is something you're very good at. Was it something you've had to kind of work towards? Or did you kind of already have that established ability to talk to the lay person about scientific things?
Yeah, well, so I guess the slightly longer version of my origin story or whatever, I started college as an English major. When I was in high school, I wanted to write books. And I didn't actually start liking science until college. So I sort of flip-flopped a bunch of times before finding this weird intersection between the 2 fields. So I'd already had experience writing, and I always knew that I liked to play around with words. The science writing, though, it feels like a totally different breed of writing. And I definitely had to unlearn a lot of the impulses to write with lots of jargon and use all the field specific terms. So I sounded smart, and I was being super precise about my data, and avoid metaphors and start every single paper with a really obscure definition. It's hard. I mean, I think the fact that a lot of my source material is still written in heavily scientific language, every time I read a paper, I have to cleanse with writing for the general public before I can start writing myself. Otherwise, I find myself starting to slip back into terms, or terms that I know I'm really familiar with, but my readers aren't. It's hard. And again, another kind of shout out to the editing process. It's there to sort of weed that out. I think some of it did come more naturally to me because I loved writing before I started science writing, but no, it's been such a process. I have to think about that every single day and suppress certain impulses. But I think what I always think back to is what I was taught to speak. I was not taught to speak to scientists. I was taught to speak to people. So I just go back to what my base instincts are. And I talk out loud. I talk to people who aren't scientists and sort of bounce ideas off of them, or I even talk to myself a little bit, the writing process, a little bit talking to yourself. And I think that is a really helpful way sometimes when I am feeling stuck.
Any other questions for Katie or Katz?
This is Calvin.
Calvin.
He's in one of my stories from last week.
Well,
Hungry, so he's bugging me.
So I have another question, which is, what advice do you have on dealing with burnout? This is something that a lot of people have experienced during the pandemic, especially if they have family obligations at home. Do you have any advice on that in that regard?
Did you say burnout?
Yes.
Yeah. I feel like I am really bad at dealing with burnout and not being a workaholic. So I may be a terrible person to answer this question, but yeah, totally. I think what really frustrated me at the beginning of the pandemic was like, there's this bizarre mentality of like, oh, you no longer have social obligations. You no longer have commute to work. Look at all this extra free time you have to work. Shouldn't you be 150 times as productive now? Which is like, it's BS, right? Like we were all going through crisis. We were all trying to readjust to things. Some of us had families at home and suddenly had to be 4 people at once. And yeah, it's really hard to work from home. In some ways it's convenient, but I also have like cats bothering me all day. They jump into my Zoom meetings. And I don't have children, but it would be 14,000 times more disruptive potentially if I did. I can't imagine some of the stress that some of my friends are going through right now. I think like as we're sort of transitioning into this next phase of the pandemic, what I keep telling people is, you know, continue being kind to yourself and do not hold yourself to a standard that is being set by another person. Like don't compare what you're going through to what someone else is going through. And that can apply to anything from like when you personally are ready to take your mask off versus like when you personally are going to decline a social invitation because you were literally just tired. Going back to whatever normal life is I think really just about communicating and setting expectations. One thing I'm really looking forward to seeing is hopefully some like more flexible, I guess, stipulations about where people are allowed to work. If people have office jobs, maybe workplaces will be more flexible about people working from home or keeping hours that are not 9 to 5. That could help with, you know, transitioning out of this burnout period and just easing people back in. Not everyone's going to operate in the same way. And I'm hoping one silver lining of this pandemic is that people are just going to have to learn how to communicate with each other going forward, and that's going to stick around.
All right. Anybody else? We've got a few minutes left. Andrew.
Yeah, I want to ask about the story collider. I don't exactly have a question. I mostly, like, I don't know too much about the story collider except that it sounds really cool. So if you can like talk more about how you got involved with that and maybe how that is a very different kind of science communication than your journalistic role.
Yeah, I think one thing to like, I really separate in my brain the work that I do for Story Collider from science journalism, because as a journalist, like I can't really identify, I think, as a science communicator per se. You know, I often am translating scientific findings to a non-scientific audience, but I have to be an objective observer, like a filter for information. And I don't necessarily want to be like unilaterally championing science, or like sometimes my job is to make something look very bad or reflect poorly on a group of scientists, or even, you know, be really critical of work. And so like, my goal is not to like engender enthusiasm about science necessarily, but to inform people about scientific information that can help them better understand the world around them. And that doesn't always like necessarily slant one way or another. With Story Collider, I think one thing I'm always thinking about is like, who can sort of see themselves as involved with science? Can we loosen that definition a little bit? And so, you know, that's about like engaging people with how science works, and like, I think acquainting people with how a lot of the small decisions they make in their lives are about science, whether it's like visiting a doctor's office or like doing an experiment to figure out who is stealing the milk out of your college dorm room, or like literally just being a scientist and like talking about how it's okay to have feelings when you're pipetting. That's okay. I love the work I do with Story Collider, and you know, I try not to see it as like endorsing one viewpoint of the world or another, but just helping people process their feelings and tell their stories. I think it makes me a better journalist because it makes me think about like personal stakes and how every person I talk to, whether a scientist or non-scientist, is a human being. And it is natural for human emotion to intersect with science, and that sometimes that's where the best science comes from. But sorry, I should have started with this, but Story Collider is basically about telling true personal stories that have something to do with science. So it's like The Moth, if some of you have heard of that, but with a scientific kind of bent to it. Some of the people who tell stories for us are scientists, or they are people who have never touched a piece of lab equipment or haven't even opened a science textbook since like high school. But the goal is just to get everyone familiar with the idea that everyone has a story to tell about science. And so during normal times, we would have people get up on stage and tell 8 to 10 minute stories, just them and a mic, no slides, no laser pointers, no props. Now we're doing that with all virtual shows, same idea, just, you know, no like third dimension. But we're hoping to get back to the old model soon. And, you know, I really love doing it. I think a lot of times we encounter scientists who tell us they don't have stories, and I'm always like, oh no, we will find one, because you definitely have one if you want to tell it. But yeah, I welcome stories about Story Collider outside of this Zoom meeting as well.
Well, folks, I think there's time for one more question if anyone wants to get the last word in.
I'll ask one if no one else wants to. So some of us on this call have actually done the AAAS Mass Media Fellowship as well. And I was wondering if you had advice for people who have maybe taken a break from science writing and then want to get back into it. If you have any pros or cons of freelancing, or what your personal preferences are.
Yeah, I think the really nice thing is science writing is not like academia where like you leave and you can never go back in. I mean, that's not entirely true either, but there's this bizarre culture where like it's really hard to go back in once you leave. I feel like anyone can write about science at any time. I mean, I know full-time academics who do science writing on the side, and it's totally easy for them to sort of break into new outlets. It is hard starting out for sure, but if you've done it before, like leverage those old connections. If you've worked with an editor before, email them and say, hey, I want to write again. Do you know anyone? Do they know anyone? It is a very networking heavy job, for better or for worse, but that is always a very good way to sort of establish yourself. I've always found that like if you do have scientific chops, it's really good to leverage them. I think especially during this pandemic, editors have really appreciated hearing from people with scientific expertise, like saying, hey, I would love to report on this story that I have kind of intimate knowledge of, or like I have the perfect sources for. I personally have never been just the type of person who wants to freelance full time, but that is super specific to me and who I am. It's just not for me, but I know people who make like more money than I do as freelancers and are super, super happy. They get to take vacations whenever they want. They get to write whenever they want. They get to write about whatever they want. I love being in a staff position because I like working with the same set of people, having that sort of like camaraderie, having colleagues to learn from, and also just the stability of like, I know where my next paycheck is coming from. I know how much it's going to be. Yeah, and health insurance is great. I'm really into health insurance. But no, like both have pros and cons. You know, one is not necessarily better than the other. If any of you have questions about freelancing, feel free to ask. Freelancing is also like much less terrifying when you are doing it on the side, I think. So it's a good way to sort of keep your writing skills sharp even when you're doing something else. Yeah, it's also a really good way to work with a ton of different outlets at once.
Thanks.
Hi, Katie. I wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for your honesty and your willingness to be vulnerable with us. And I would like to ask, what method do you suggest the fellows use to contact you after this if they have follow-up questions or, need more advice on their, at moving forward in their careers?
Yeah, you're welcome to share my email. It's probably the best way. I might not respond right away because my inbox is a really scary place right now, but I will definitely try.
Great, thank you.
All right, well, with that, let's all give Katie a big, warm, digital round of applause. Thanks so much for being here and joining with us.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And you all asked really great questions. Thank you so much.